our third session of our today. Today we'll be looking at Race Crossings, the WHO. So just to introduce Bridget, Bridget is a recognised leading thinker in inclusiveness and human-centred planning in New Zealand. She's a Masters of Engineering in Transportation and a PhD in Cognitive Psychology. There's a lot of long words in this introduction, Bridget.
Sorry about that. Sorry, not sorry.
Thank you, but very difficult. Her fascinating PhD topic was mind wandering during everyday driving, and learnings from this will feature in our presentation today. So she's also a chartered member of Engineering New Zealand and chair of the New Zealand Transportation Group. From my perspective, Bridget is one of those few people who happily pedal the lonely territory between academic research and capital works programs that shape our communities. I'm excited to introduce her today. We never know quite what we're going to expect, somewhere between one of those Netflix comedy series and some kind of inspirational TED Talk. So it's the third time I've been to this presentation and I'm still looking forward to it. Welcome, Bridget.
Oh, thank you, Prue. And lovely to be here. Kia ora, everybody. I'm Bridget. I'm in New Zealand, in Auckland today, actually, and delighted to share this presentation with you. Prue, there's a whole 1-minute video in here that you've never seen before. So this is all very exciting, trying to keep it a bit fresh. We hope to have a lot of interaction. Just feel free to put your questions and commentary in the chat, and we'll try and keep on top of that as we go through. So what we're going to talk about today is not me, you've heard about that. Why inclusion is important, why we're talking about the WHO of race crossing design. As Prue said, I'm going to talk about my PhD topic, which was in cognitive psychology, transport psychology, about understanding how drivers behave, because that's a really important part of designing good pedestrian infrastructure. We don't want drivers and pedestrians to collide unintentionally. And then we're going to talk about the principles of inclusive transport. And if you learn nothing else from these 8 hours of webinars, you will know what SOS means by the end of it, I guarantee. And then we're also going to have a section on disability sector engagement, and I'll talk about why that's important, and hopefully we'll go away with some different thoughts about that than you might have had before as well. So firstly, why is inclusion important? We're going to touch on understanding humans and all of their diversity and human factors psychology as well. But first, I'm going to take you through a few little stories that are real examples of people's experiences using transport and infrastructure in our cities, towns and cities. So first we have Martha, and Martha was on her way to work by train in a city, and she had to change trains at one of the stations. So she was sitting on a train platform waiting for her new train to arrive. And then she happened to glance up, and most of the people from her platform were standing up, kind of staring into space. And then after a few seconds, they left the platform and went over elsewhere to another one. And by the time Martha realized what was going on, and the train that she was supposed to be on had arrived on the other platform, and her fellow passengers were getting onto it. And the reason that Martha didn't do the same thing is because she was deaf, and the transport system was not designed for her. The information announcement wasn't designed for her to get that information. So she was literally left behind from the train platform. The second story is about Lara and Kelly, and Lara and Kelly are friends. They both happen to use...
we've just got to get into presenter view. Just realised we're not in presenter view.
Okay.
Down the little...
Hang on. Where is it?
It's down there. It's down the bottom right-hand corner. Yes.
Is that better?
No, it's still not in presenter view.
That didn't change anything for me either. Slideshow. Because I had done that. It's just, I think it's sharing the wrong screen.
Okay.
Which screen are you seeing?
We're seeing the one that's not in presenter view.
Okay, so I'll just share it again. And I will share this one. How's that?
Perfect, perfect.
So Lara and Kelly are friends. They both use wheelchairs, and they were going to go to a concert together, and the concert had been advertised as having an accessible venue, an accessible toilet, which is usually a good sign that it's accessible. So off they went. They decided to catch the bus. It was a couple of kilometres away and a bit too far to push yourself in a wheelchair with Auckland topography on hills. But the first bus that went past was full and didn't stop for them. The second bus that went past wasn't full, but the driver didn't stop anyway, which is something that happens sometimes. And the third one, there was somebody already on the bus who had a pram and there was no space for them and no accommodation made for them. So they decided to wheel themselves to the concert venue. And this issue of buses not doing what they're legally supposed to do is not uncommon when you talk to disabled people. So it's good to have a transport system that has redundancy. In other words, there's more than one way for people to get around and choices for people to have. So they managed to wheel themselves to the venue. There must have been some nice raised crossings along the way because they're a really good accessible way for people who use wheelchairs to cross the street. They got to the venue, and even though it had an accessible bathroom, there was steps to get into the venue, so they couldn't go to the concert. So they went back home again and did not get to do that. And on top of that, they were just tired out from a mammoth kind of mission to nowhere. And the third story is about Duncan, who uses a white cane to move around. This picture is a bit misleading. Actually, I should change it because not many blind people have a guide dog and a white cane at the same time. That's a bit unusual. But anyway, Duncan uses a white cane. And he was navigating some streets in his local neighbourhood, and he came up to a newly laid tactile ground surface indicator, tactile paving at the intersection, and they were in a staggered formation, which meant that he was oriented in the wrong direction to cross the street. He didn't know that. It was only that his partner was with him and was able to say to him, hey, you're going to walk straight into the traffic if you go that way. So he had to, well, he chose to contact the council and let them know that this was not right. But as Duncan says, it shouldn't be on the job of disabled people to let council know when they haven't followed their own standards. So this is why inclusion is important. It's because the decisions that we make as transport professionals affect people's lives all the time. And disabled people are kind of like, because I have a civil engineering background and I'm used to designing beams and columns, and I'm not used to it. I couldn't do it if you paid me, but I did learn 20 years ago how to do that. And when you learn how to design a beam, you start with a design load. So your design load on a beam is like the worst case scenario. How much snow is going to fall on this roof, or what kind of earthquake load is there going to be? And can we reasonably predict for this building? And you design a beam that is just strong enough to withstand that, but not too strong, because then you're just wasting money in an over expensive beam. On our streets, I think of disabled people as our design pedestrians, because we want to design our streets and infrastructure well enough and safe enough so that humans in all their variety can use it. And the most extreme kind of human that we have is a disabled person, because they have the least amount of choices in terms of being able to overcome those challenges and go a different way, or run a bit faster, or navigate things differently. So a disabled person is like a design user, and if we don't design transport and infrastructure well for them, then they have this time cost, and that can be related to the consistency and that kind of redundancy that I alluded to earlier in those stories. As an example here, someone's told, we have a lot of quotes from research with disabled people, they talk about this time cost all the time. So someone said, my mother's birthday is a trip that I didn't make. We talk also about trips not made because of the effort involved. It was in the central city, would have been an absolute nightmare with unreliable trains, next to no close parking, having to pay parking and petrol on a low income. It seemed like a nightmare. So this time cost, the out-of-pocket cost, and the unreliability of those costs and processes and systems just mean that it all gets a bit too hard. And the result, if we don't design nice accessible infrastructure, is that people don't go out and live their lives and do all the things that make life worth living, which is a real shame. And let's not be the people whose decisions cause that kind of thing. As I said in that story about Duncan, tactile ground surface indicators can make or break a journey or a person if they're laid incorrectly and send people out into the wrong way. Many people, not just disabled people, but people in general, cannot read the language of transport infrastructure. We're going to come back to this concept a few times in this webinar, because it's a challenge for us all as transport professionals to overcome our own habits and biases and knowledge, actually, to try and look at things fresh and look at infrastructure from the perspective of someone who doesn't live and breathe those manuals and design guides that we use. If we know what this picture is, for example, we know that that's tactile paving. A child wouldn't know that. A migrant might not know that. Someone who's had a brain injury might not know that. So we need to think about how intuitive our designs are and therefore how safe they are, because if they're not intuitive, then what are people going to do? How are they going to behave in that context? We need to be thinking about that. So inclusion is important because it's a good thing to do, to design for all people, but it's also important because it's written into all of our policies at state and regional and national levels that we want transport and infrastructure to include all people. Here's an example from the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads, and it says down the bottom there that TMR is obligated to comply with all disability, anti-discrimination and human rights legislation. So we have a lot of advocates in the disability sector who end up complaining when that doesn't happen, and that happens all over the world, because all of these governments have inherited legacy infrastructure that's doesn't necessarily work well or meet those legislation obligations. But at least when we're designing new stuff, we should do our best to make sure that it does. And in New Zealand, we have similar words in our policies. The land transport system needs to enable a range of lower cost and more efficient choices so all people can easily access all of these opportunities. And if you're ever looking for justification for putting in a raised crossing, for example, or another kind of crossing or piece of infrastructure that you know is going to be inclusive, and if you have somebody pushing back saying, oh, we don't need to do that, just chuck in a refuge island or something, you can point them to this kind of legislation. And a phrase to look out for is this one about all people. Can all people cross the road at a refuge island when it's a 50k road and it's got 10,000 vehicles a day? No, they can't. So we want to demonstrate that we are following that policy and those rules, and we can find those, like I say, at local and regional level. And remember, of course, what Hafez was talking about last week, that we have the safe system principles, and when we talk about disabled people and the variety of humans, they have a variety of capabilities, but they're also vulnerable and fallible, likely to make mistakes in a whole bunch of different ways. And when we think about who we're talking about in that system, it's all people in all of their variety, and not just people who look and act and think like us. Which humans are we talking about? It's not just the cohort of transport professionals, people as fit and active as we all are, but it's everybody. So when I mention capabilities, I like to think about these kinds of things as a spectrum, even though I talk about disabled people and it's a handy group to talk about because they've got a wealth of experience in challenging situations. Actually, we're talking about ourselves and our variety of capabilities and states, and all of us were born pretty useless, not being able to walk or even crawl. All we could do was kind of cry and poo our pants, basically. So we all come from that state. A lot of us end up in that state as well as we get older. So through our lifespan, we have a whole range of experiences that mean we're not on top of our game all the time. We can't always run across a street. And so these things are spectrums in terms of how much strength we have, what we can see, how much we can hear, and how strong our hands are. Some people can't push a button. I can't push a button if I'm carrying coffee in both hands, for example. So there's lots of reasons that limit our capability at any momentary time. And that moment might just happen to be when we're about to cross a street. And as well as our physical characteristics, we've also got a wide variety of states. And I think about this one all the time. Like today, for example, I like to get up at 5:15 to get the train to Auckland from Hamilton, where I live, because there's literally one train a day and it leaves at 6:15. So I'm pretty tired. My energy is a bit low. So we all have these kinds of fluctuations in our energy and our mood, how calm we feel, how excited we are. Being in pain is a really interesting one for me. We don't learn much about chronic pain at transport engineering school, but pain affects a lot of people around the place. If you think of any cityscape or the main street of any town or city that you're in, if you've got, you know, dozens of people or hundreds of people, there are going to be some of those people who are in pain. They might have their period, they might be recovering from surgery, they might have arthritis. There's a whole lot of reasons that people have pain all the time. And again, the easier we can make it for those people to cross the street and to make those crossings really obvious, it's just going to make their lives easier to get wherever they need to be going. So these inclusion, the who of raised crossings that we're talking about is not just one particular group of people, it's all of us and all of our various capabilities and states. And the better we can do to design for those least able to cope with different scenarios, the more able we will all be to use them. So with that in mind, we're going to jump over to Miro. And Prue is going to bring us, I think, to exercise 1. We are going to look at this crossing. So comment with sticky notes, which are over on the left-hand side. You'll see underneath the A, there's a comment. Oh no, just under the arrow at the top, sticky note. Choose what color you want. I think I'm going to go blue today. Who could use this crossing easily? At the top, we've just got curb cuts. They're sometimes called pram ramps or drop curbs. If there's a road crossing there and all it is drop curbs, who could use that? Well, I'm going to write that my 14-year-old on his bike could use that. And he does use those kinds of things. He could use that to cross the street, no problem. A raised priority crossing, on the other hand, well, he could use that too, but I'm going to say, in this example, my 76-year-old mother, she could use the curb ramps as well, to be fair, but I'd be much happier sending her to the shops in this direction using a raised crossing, because it's just so much safer and more obvious. So have a go at writing some suggestions. You can do one for each example. You can do more than one if you want to. You guys are doing a really good job there. Me and my kids without shouting, but I probably end up shouting at them to look or run. Well, exactly. There's something about these crossings that affects your comfort using them as well, isn't it? It's not just about who could physically use the crossing to cross the street. We could add an element of how we would feel about that, how much comfort we would have doing it, how quickly we feel we'd have to cross the street, how likely we would be to be mowed down. It just so happens one of these is a mid-block and one's at an intersection, so there's some differences going on there as well. But as you've all observed, almost all humans can use the bottom one. And the fact we say almost all, that's a really good point actually, because I quite often say that if you're a person who has pain moving around, or if you're a disabled person, if you find moving difficult generally in your life, then you're going to move around less often than other people are. You're not going to do as much moving as somebody who you know, runs 10 kilometers a day for fun. So even if the world were 100% designed to all of our codes and standards and we had raised crossings everywhere, you would not get the same proportion of people using the crossing as there are disabled people in the world. So in New Zealand, for example, this stat will come up later, but 24% of our population is a disabled person, but you'd never get 24% of people using a road crossing be disabled people for that reason, because they don't tend to travel as much because it's a lot more difficult. But the opportunity is there, and that's the whole point, that we're enabling people access to the opportunities that make life worth living and also are essential services that keep people well. So we'll go back out of Miro for a moment, and you did a really good job there. Human characteristics and states affect people's ability to cross the street, but there's this interaction of, well, what kind of infrastructure is there to help them out crossing that street? There's also an element of the street itself, right? Like I didn't give you any information about traffic speeds or volumes or how wide those streets are. There wasn't a scale on there, but all of that comes into it as well. And we make decisions about those things, which is why you're here. And we're trying to provide the best opportunities we can to make those choices easier for people, give them options. Now, alongside characteristics and states, we also have this influence of income. So in the top of this circle, we've got all of those states, human states that I talked about before, how comfortable people are, how calm they feel, how much energy they have, how well they are, whether they feel a bit sick or not. And, you know, we're now in the era of cold and flu symptoms, and we're all very aware of how well we feel day to day. And all of these things affect people crossing the street as well. And their physical characteristics, body strength, sight and hearing, and hand strength. But all of those have this interaction with income to affect how often and by what mode of transport and what route people take to get out and about, because travelling costs money at some level. So there is a role for understanding diversity of income in decision making, and Prue would have talked about last week how we decide where we're putting raised crossings, and one of the things we can think about is the kind of community that we're in, what kinds of activities people want to meet, want to be able to access, and income is something that we can map because we have census data, so we can use that to help prioritise where we might put different infrastructure depending on the government priorities. So having said all that, what has income got to do with raised crossings? We're going to jump straight back into Miro and go down a little bit to exercise number 2. And I've got 3 statements here. And what we're going to do is to choose an emoji. So if you go down to the left-hand side, and there's 2 little arrows underneath the comment button that says more apps, and underneath more apps, is it where it's stickers? No, yeah, stickers and emojis. So you can choose a sticker or emoji and put that on the exercise board to explain how you feel about these statements. So
Bridget, can we share the Miro board, or would you like me to share it?
Is it not coming up in my sharing? Yeah, you can share it.
I'll share it.
Yeah, some people are finding them.
Yes.
So yeah, it's 2 little, there we go, Prue's showing you 2 little arrows, and then about the 6th option down, stickers and emojis. And you can see which sticker or emoji you want. So there are 3 statements here. You just give me an emoji to say how you feel about these things. One of them is that poorer areas get less infrastructure investment. How does that make you feel? You might agree or disagree. You might make you happy or sad. It might be frustrating. Might just make you think of trees. Don't know.
This is a statement, not a question. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a statement. So it's you don't have to put an answer. You can just choose an emoji to say how that statement makes you feel. Poorer areas get less infrastructure investment. That may be true or maybe not true. How do you feel about it? The second one is poor people are less likely to have a car, so they're forced to walk. What do you think about that? What does that make you think in terms of an emotional reaction? And the third one is that people in fancier cars are less likely to give way to pedestrians. So in terms of the first one, you can still react to this because I'm going to explain my rationale for putting these statements up there. It's well known in published literature that poorer communities, whatever income measure you use, poorer communities attract less public investment on the whole. So less investment in transport infrastructure, which means they're going to have worse quality paths and road crossings, generally on average across any city in the developed world. Doesn't mean that there aren't poor communities that have great infrastructure. It's just on average it's not as good. So what does that mean? Well, it means they're going to have fewer raised crossings, for example, on average, and they're going to therefore have fewer safe choices about how to get around. So they are also more likely to show up in road crash accident statistics for a lot of reasons, not just infrastructure. The second statement is that poorer people are less likely to have a car, so they are forced to walk. Well, that one's a bit complicated because while it's true that in New Zealand anyway, the average number of cars per household is lowest in poorer communities. It's also very low in some wealthy communities, which are very close to rapid transit and high density places like central cities. So poorer people in general are less likely to have a motor vehicle, but they also sometimes are dependent on a car, so they spend more than they can afford on a car, so then they have fewer choices otherwise, and they're more likely to have fewer cars per household as well. So some people in that household either have to walk or use public transport or bike, or they won't go places. So it's not necessarily that they're forced to walk, it's that they're forced to choose between an uncomfortable or inconvenient or unsafe transport mode and not participating at all, not going to school or work or out to meet friends or whatever it was that they would otherwise have done. The third statement is that people in fancier cars are less likely to give way to pedestrians, and I put that there because there was one journal article published that said people in Mercedes Benzes and BMWs were statistically less likely to yield at a pedestrian crossing than people in other cars were. So I don't know whether that study's been replicated. It might have been just an anomaly for that paper. I must go look it up actually. So it, it's just a nice kind of, it appeals to some people who listen to talkback radio to hear that and to therefore comment about it. But, people who drive cars are more likely to yield at a priority crossing like a raised zebra than at one that isn't a priority, like the curb ramp example earlier.
Bridget?
Yeah.
So with the poorer infrastructure, poorer areas getting less infrastructure, I know when I was reading a while ago, it was talking about how unconscious bias affects our infrastructure planning and talking about how people in workplaces have this tendency to provide for people like themselves who are people in workplaces getting to work. And we have this real focus on providing for these work trips. Is that potentially something that's feeding into this in the experience?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it happens at different levels. There's a historic bias in professional transport planning towards commute to work trips. Partly that's because people who work in transport planning commute to work. It's not explicit, I think it's implicit. Partly because we value men's work more than women, and women are much more likely to have much more diverse trip making and to do volunteer work that's not paid and that's not in peak hours, and it's not based in the central city where the transport networks come and go to. So there's a lot of historic reasons why that's the case. Yeah, and so I think one of the opportunities that we have, one of the promising things that's happening is that there's more and more diversity in transport sector, more and more women, more and more ethnic diversity, not so much disability diversity in the profession that I've noticed, but as we do get more diversity, we get more diversity of thinking, and then you tend to have a switch from conversations about traffic and networks to conversations about people and communities and well-being and equity and outcomes and things like that. So it's changing, and I think for the better, and it's going to be interesting to see over the next decade, especially with climate change imperatives coming through in policy more strongly all the time, how these kinds of practices might change. So it's just another thing to bear in mind if you're trying to justify a raised crossing or any kind of inclusive, accessible infrastructure, to think about income and to use that to your advantage in arguing for the best outcome for the community you're working for. Oh, there's my instructions about how to get the stickers and emojis. Good one, Bridget. Should have done that first. Okay, so we're talking earlier about humans' capabilities and states, and this is a really nice way to explain that. It's quite a good example if any of you want to do a little morning tea session for your workmates about what you've learned on this course, or just maybe in your team sometime. You can just Google, or there's a link there, Microsoft Inclusive Design. They have a free inclusive design toolkit, and this is a really nice way of explaining different kinds of challenges. So we have on the left column permanent impairments. So permanent impairments can be usually what people are born with, or that they've become permanent through an injury or an illness. So someone can permanently have an impairment where they only have one arm. They might be an amputee. They may be blind, and obviously these things are permanent. However, there's also what's quite interesting and people can relate to a bit more is temporary and situational impairments. So temporary, the examples here are mostly to do with kind of an injury or illness. So, one that we have become aware of recently is long COVID. So some people have long COVID kind of brain fatigue and brain fog, and you'll probably have colleagues or friends who have talked to about this, and they say, I just wasn't thinking the same. My brain was foggy, and that's hopefully a temporary impairment that affects the way they think. And then we have situational impairments, and I think these are a really helpful way to explain why inclusive infrastructure is a good idea, because it's something that most people can relate to. So if you think of a situational hearing impairment, for example, is when you've got headphones in. So if you're going for a walk and you have headphones and you're listening to a podcast, that's perfectly legal and worthy thing to do. Learn something, out for a walk is great, but that listening to that podcast means that your hearing is situationally impaired compared to if you weren't listening to it, if you're just listening to the birds and the traffic. When we think about vision, it's important to remember that not all drivers are looking at the road all of the time, and some of that impairment is a requirement of the driving task, because they have to look at their speedo, they have to look at, they might have an in-car navigation system that they're perfectly legally allowed to be looking at, but it does mean that their eyes are off the road for different lengths of time. So it's not just that there's permanent disabled people who we're designing for when we're doing inclusive design. We're designing for everybody, and with our increasingly complex and busy lives, there's a whole variety of ways that hopefully people can relate to that. So this image is portraying that the permanent impairment is actually the smallest of the three. There's a group of people who have permanent impairment. Obviously for them, that situation is very serious. It affects their life in a major way if the world isn't designed in an inclusive way. Whereas if you go to the other end of the spectrum, situational impairments such as carrying a child or a cup of coffee, doing something else at the same time, you're wearing headphones, or you're carrying luggage. A lot of people can relate to that. If you're traveling from an airport to your hotel and you've got a lot of bags, that just weighs you down. It's harder to use transport to open doors, to cross the street, and everything else. So these situational impairments are shorter term, but they affect all of us some of the time. So they're out there, and a good thing to bear in mind as another justification. So let's just go into the chat and give me some commentary in there about some situational impairments that you think might affect people crossing the street. So what kind of situational impairment? There was an example just in the picture on the right there about someone just being overloaded. What's another kind of situational impairment, do you think? Yeah, alcohol. Yep, alcohol's situational, or arguably temporary, depends if you're physically drinking it at the time, how much you had. Pets, oh, that's a good one. I haven't seen that actually. So if you've got a particularly rambunctious dog, is that the right word, Prue? Maybe you can incorporate that in my bio next time, rambunctious. Or just playful. Yeah, sun on the horizon's good. Having a toddler, young children, having a toddler in one direction and a dog in the other. Being angry is good. I find being upset too. A couple of times I've driven when I was really upset, and you're really not, you know that you're not on top of your game. Yeah, being stressed, exactly. So we don't want to, the worst thing we could do as an outcome of all of this is to put up a sign saying, hey, everyone, relax. Before you cross the street, just chill. Because humans are humans, and signs don't run the world, our brains do, whether we like it or not. And our brains have evolved over millennia to be the way they are and to follow the channels that have been carved out for them. Oh, these are all excellent examples. Heavy raining's good. We had some thunderstorms in Hamilton yesterday. It was very distracting. So the purpose of all of this is to say, well, we should design infrastructure that accounts for the way that humans are in all of their various situations. So it's a good thing to chat about even with your family. If you've got teenagers, they're going to be learning to drive soon, and it's good to just kind of prep them. This is what I do. I've been prepping my son for years with all these kinds of tidbits. just about how humans are and all their variety. We can't expect anybody to be perfect because we're not perfect, and wouldn't life be boring if we all were? So think about it when you're out and about. That's why it's so good working in transport, because you've always got these little case studies you can learn from every time you go out and use a street. You can think about how you're feeling. Just imagine how other people might be feeling. Quite a good game if you're walking with someone is to, guess the stress levels of other people coming towards you, make up some scenarios of why they might look the way they do. I do that all the time, especially with people in airports. It's quite interesting. Yeah, everybody is different. So now that we know why we're here, why we're talking about inclusive access, at a higher level, if you're working in transport policy or planning, a way that I think about inclusive access is to say, well, with road safety, we have a pretty clear question that we're trying to answer with all of us who work in road safety, and that is, are we reducing deaths and serious injuries? It's very clear, it's measurable. We know whether we're doing that at a fine-grained level, at an individual street and crossing, and at a national level in terms of our overall statistics. When we talk about inclusion and inclusive access, sometimes it's right up there in the same part of the policy as road safety. We want road safety to improve. We want inclusion to improve. But at the moment, we've got no way to measure that. So I like to think about it in terms of, are we encouraging participation? When we're talking about encouraging participation, as I've said, disabled people are a quite useful design user to think about. And I've been saying disabled people a lot, but that language varies by country. In New Zealand, we say disabled people, and this language has been tested with disability groups and the community themselves, and there's links there into the national websites that have said this is the language that we use in these countries. In Australia, we use both. So in Australia, you can say people with disability and disabled people. But if you're working with a specific group or a specific person, the best thing to do is to ask them. It's a bit like asking someone their pronouns. I'm going to talk about disabled people. Is that the right language to use, or would you prefer something else? It's appreciated when you ask. So now we're going to move into something completely different, which is human behaviour in traffic. And this is some insights into my PhD, and why I studied psychology for my PhD is because I'm interested in what goes on in people's heads and why it seems like what goes on in their heads is different from what goes on in mine. And I love this Dave Matthews song, I have no lid upon my head, but if I did, you could look inside and see what's on my mind. Well, psychologists are getting pretty clever with the technology they can use, but at the moment they're really just measuring electrical impulses and blood flow around the brain to try and guess which parts are active, or to find out which parts are active at different times. Thoughts themselves and the character and flavor of those thoughts are an entirely different thing. And that's what I'm interested in. But what's this got to do with the who of raised crossings? It's not all about humans and their behavior as they cross the street, but driver behavior is kind of at the center of the whole, all of these modules, right? So if we're thinking about where to put raised crossings, we need to think about the forgivingness of road environments. And if we're thinking about why we're doing these in the first place, we had Hafez talking about how humans make mistakes and how speed management can influence that. And on Wednesday, we're going to hear from Ken about standards and rules like reaction times and really complicated, or not that complicated, you'll manage them, equations to work out visibility and the gradients and speed that we can design crossings for. And all of those things come back to understanding driver behavior, and that's where they all stem from. So that's why we're here. And in my PhD, I studied mind wandering during everyday driving. So that is literally what a driver's thinking about when they're driving and what happens when they're not thinking about driving. So can they daydream, and is that okay? And I'm interested in how this thing happens and can still be safe, because I daydream all the time in everyday life and during driving, and I didn't think I was that special. I had a hunch that actually quite a lot of people probably do that. So if a lot of people are doing that, why aren't they crashing all the time? And that's what I was interested in, why I studied it. There was also some literature at the time saying that driver mind wandering is associated with risk for crash involvement. And there's still papers coming out saying mind wandering is a major factor in road crashes. And I'm like, well, is it really? How do you know that? If you knew that mind wandering was a factor in crash risk, you would have to know whether people were concentrating on driving when they crashed. And if a police officer collected that information, would the driver be honest if you just had a crash and the police officer was coming and filling out their form and they said, okay, what were you thinking about just before the crash? I don't think you could reliably tell them because you've just crashed. That's a very stressful situation. And B, if you were thinking about, a Netflix series that you're watching last night, you're going to tell the police officer that? Like, it feels like something that we can't really know for sure, which is why this billboard confounded me as a kind of statistician, evidence-based thinker. Like, how do we know whether wandering minds cause crashes if we don't know how often it happens in the first place? So that's what I set out to investigate. And it turned out that daydreaming while driving is been something people have thought about for a long time. I quite like this headline on the top right, which is from 1940, New Zealand Herald. What annoys drivers? Number 2, pedestrians with their heads in the clouds, as if walking is something that you should only do to seriously pay attention, and the joy of going for a walk is not something that should ever happen. And the one on the bottom left, if you haven't seen that, that's quite a good one as well, especially the last 2 sentences. Driving a car is a full-time job. It cannot safely be combined with sociability, lovemaking, sightseeing, window shopping, or daydreaming. So I'm thinking, is daydreaming really as bad while driving as lovemaking? Like, I'm pretty sure one of those things is more risky than the other one. So I set out to investigate one of them, although there has just been a paper come out about sexual behaviours during driving by some Australian researchers. And that's a really interesting paper. If you are that way inclined, you can go and find it. However, in my PhD, I wanted to know how often drivers' minds wander. And so I asked them in a variety of ways, the surveys and on-road tests, and my estimate is that on familiar urban roads, most drivers' minds are wandering between half and 2/3 of the time. So if you're in a mid-block, I think it's closer to 80 or 90%. So if they're not stopped at a junction or approaching a junction, I think most drivers most of the time are thinking about dinner or work or family or something else. All drivers report mind wandering at least occasionally because they're human, right? And it's also something that you have to do. When you're driving somewhere, you have to spend part of your time thinking about where you're going, or else you won't get there. If you're only focused on the road in front of you, then you are a self-driving automaton and not a human. So mind wandering is necessary and it's ubiquitous, and you can't separate it out from the human condition with a sign saying concentrate. So what does that matter? Well, it means that we can learn some stuff about how that varies and how to capture drivers' attention when it's a good idea to do so. I took out a sample of 25 drivers who did this loop around Hamilton City where I live, and every few minutes at places where I knew I was going to ask them this question, but they didn't know, I said, what are you thinking about now? And they told me. And some of the things they would say was like this. I don't know. This is the kind of categories that people would have. Like, one is just a nice day for a drive, not too busy. So that person is engaged somewhat in their environment of driving. The second one, don't really know, nothing much. I think that on average, 20%, drivers are thinking about nothing 20% of the time. And that's interesting because there's a certain proportion of the population who thinks about nothing a lot. I think it's more likely to be men than women. I've done studies, and I think it's true. Like, if you ask me, I'm never thinking about nothing, but a whole lot of people actually are, and I believe them because I've sat in the car and watched them and they're like, nothing. Some people will say they're hungry. People think about food almost as much as they think about nothing. And then the fourth one is really common, and that's kind of an active thinker who's a bit bored and they're like, I was thinking about dogs. Have you noticed how many dogs are out this morning? So that's what I call an environmentally triggered task unrelated thought. There's some big syllables for you, Prue. Because people will often see something and then that'll trigger some other thought, like someone say, oh, I like that woman's dress that was wearing at the bus stop. And then they're thinking about shopping and there's a sale coming up and it's Christmas. And so they go off on this tangent that's completely unrelated to the bus stop. And dogs and people out walking dogs is a really common one too. The least mind wandering happens in unpredictable places where people have learned that they can't switch off. And so there's this intersection in Hamilton where I live. It's called Five Crossroads because there's 5 roads, and it's been there for several decades, and it doesn't really have the infrastructure standards you'd expect from a 2-lane roundabout if it was built now. So it's really tight. There aren't that many crashes there though, because everybody is paying attention and they think it's horrendous, so they're all going really slow. And out of the 25 people who drove through there, and I asked them what they're thinking about, 5 of them said, "I hate this roundabout," a very emotional reaction that they didn't have to any other stretches of street. So yeah,
in terms of what's happening there as well, is there's people who would naturally walk there have decided, no, it's just too hard. If something goes wrong, I'm going to get killed. So
totally. Yeah, there's actually, it's an interesting site actually, because there's a raised crossing put in there about 10 years ago. And me and a friend of mine in the disability sector went out and counted pedestrians crossing the street before and after. So there was a flush crossing before, and then they raised it. And the number of pedestrians went up by 27% or something, but the number of pedestrians using a wheelchair or a mobility aid went up like 87%. So not only were there more people overall, there's more diversity of people, because all of the things that we've been saying over these modules, that they're just a much more inclusive and safe feeling and welcoming piece of infrastructure. Because exactly right, if you're at that intersection and there's no protection for you, especially as we all know, vehicles accelerate away from a roundabout and it's just nasty. So yeah. So comment in the chat, what's one thing when I was talking about that stuff that you think about when you're driving? Someone said, what I'm going to do when I get to where I'm going. Yeah, so another one of my studies, I talked to women when they were driving to and from their work. So I met them at their house, they went to work, and then I met them at the end of the day, went home again and did that for 5 days. And often on the way to work, they're thinking about work. Often on the way home, they're thinking about work. And then it was interesting, the closer they got to home, the more they thought about home and tonight and what's happening and do I need to go to the supermarket. Most people's thoughts are confined to the day that they're living. Not many people actually are thinking that far out into the future. Maybe that was partly because it was the trip to work, so they're focused on their work day and stuff, and the people that are at work kind of gossip about work. A lot of people thinking about the weather and how that affects their life, like whether I should have done laundry today, whether I shouldn't have put laundry out because it's going to rain. The time of year, they'll be like noticing the changes. Yeah, I could talk about this topic all day, but it's interesting that people tend to notice changes in the landscapes and the landmarks on their way to work. So people will say, oh, that building used to be a dentist and now it's not. That'll trigger their attention because their brain is kind of unconsciously looking for things to be the same. I had a few thought samples where people would say they've noticed, they'd comment on something that wasn't there. So one day I asked someone and they said, oh, I haven't seen my friend Brian, he's usually out jogging about this time. So not only is the brain looking for things that are changed, it's looking for things that are absent from this kind of schema, the story that the brain wants to see laid out in front of it. Because when there are changes from that, that's when the brain brings your conscious awareness back. If something's unusual, it's like, hey, autopilot can't handle this, you're going to need to actually think about it. So the main conclusion from all of this is that humans are amazing and brains are really reliable. There was even a study I read, not a study, but a news article during my research that said there was a woman who drove in her sleep. So she woke up in one city and she didn't go to bed there the night before, and she had travelled several hundred kilometres asleep via another city. And I think the only reason she could do that is because she stuck to state highways and there was lane markings that her autopilot could follow. But that's amazing. I don't recommend you go out and try it.
Bridget, we've had an interesting question here. So if we make roads more challenging, drivers focus more?
Yeah, to a point. So it's true, but drivers also have limits to their energy to be able to concentrate. Like all of you who are drivers, think about really challenging drives that you've been on. So for me, for example, I remember driving home 2 hours from Auckland to Hamilton one night, and it was busy motorway traffic and it was dark and it was stormy rain as well. All of those things made it really challenging. So yeah, I was paying attention, but gosh, I was tired by the time I got to the end of it. So there comes a point where the benefits from paying attention are overtaken by the bad effects of fatigue. So we want to design environments where we capture drivers' attention when we need need to, and when we need to is an art and a science, but we let them switch off when environments are forgiving and self-explaining, and they don't need to be paying attention. If you've ever driven in a third world country or a developing country, I went to Bangladesh. I've been to Bangladesh and India, and everyone pays attention there all the time, but the crash rates are very high because there's this mismatch between drivers' capabilities of handling those situations and the infrastructure, forgivingness, and traffic around them. So there's certain times when I would say we want to make this feel more hazardous, without it actually being unsafe, being less safe. So as I say here, we're talking a lot about familiar urban environments, so people driving to work and back, but what about unfamiliar places? Drivers are less likely to report daydreaming on an unfamiliar road. So if you're driving on a road for the first time, you're more likely to be paying attention. But it's also related to task difficulty. So if that new road is a really 100-kilometre long motorway, then you're quickly going to switch off for that as well, because your brain still understands what to do, so it doesn't need to make you think about it. And yeah, if you're on holiday over the Christmas time, you're going somewhere new and you're driving, then you're more likely to be thinking about environmentally triggered things. So if you're driving somewhere scenic or new, you're looking around at the scenery and your brain's trying to build a picture of what to expect in that environment, so that the next time you do it, it's easier because you don't have to be paying so much attention. And this is the reason I think why going on holiday can be tiring, because if you think you go on holiday, especially if you're moving around a lot between hotels or between locations, every time you go and set yourself up for the night, you've got to work out where the fridge is, you've got to work out where the rubbish bin is, you've got to work out where you put your toothbrush, and all these things that at home you literally don't think about. On holiday, every little decision takes your conscious brain energy, and that is draining. So that's why you can get to the end of the holiday and be like, oh, I need a holiday, because the little minutiae of everyday tasks have required your conscious focus where they don't usually at home. So all of this is to say we should design environments that don't require drivers' attention, conscious attention, but they're forgiving enough to make that safe. So drivers aren't necessarily looking for pedestrians, especially in places where they aren't used to seeing them. So that means that we have to make sure that in places where people cross the street, it's going to be safe for them. And either we make the drivers stop and look, or we make it slow enough so that that doesn't matter. And Prue talked about last time this situation of a child crossing the street. They've got multiple directions that traffic's going to be coming from. We need to understand that the child has limitations. And so the drivers themselves might not be paying attention and looking for children crossing the street. So when there's a whole lot going on, you're relying on all of that to work, mostly at an unconscious level, because drivers aren't actively thinking about it. So you might find that if this was a busy route to school and there were lots of kids crossing the street between kind of 8 and 9 in the morning, then the drivers would realise that, and they'd be going slow, and it would probably be okay. Whereas if it was 11 o'clock in the middle of the day and the traffic was busy and there was a child in that situation, well, then the drivers may be less likely. So it's interaction of a whole lot of different things, but it affects the decision about where we put raised crossings as well. So a summary of what I learned during my PhD: do wandering minds cause crashes? No, I don't think you can say that. I think it's like saying that old age causes broken hips. There's a correlation, but just because you turn, I don't want to offend anybody like my mum, turn 76, you're not necessarily going to break your hip. Mind wandering is just part of being human, and so we need to account for that. It's just one of those characteristics and states that I talked about earlier, and so this is another reason why we need a genuine safe system approach. There's these kind of crashes that you may have heard of called look but fail to see crashes, and that can happen. They happen because of a failure of the unconscious and the conscious processes interacting in a driver's brain. So you can be looking straight down a street for a gap in the traffic, for example, and not see a cyclist who is in your field of view because you're not used to seeing them. And so this happens even when drivers are focused on driving. So it's another reason that speed management is really important, so that if that kind of thing happens, both of those parties have more time to react. And if there is a collision, then it's not at a speed that's going to cause serious injury. I think this is how I was doing my PhD study, and then we're going to have a little break. So this is me sitting in the car with my participants, and this is some of the things they said when we're driving around, and I've got a little camera recording this on my phone so I can see what they're doing. And these are all in the participants' own cars, so I was trying to make it as familiar for them as possible, so they weren't in a different kind of state of mind than they might have been if they were in some kind of research vehicle that's unfamiliar to them. This kind of thing where people switch between different thoughts happens all the time as well. You know, it's really hard to define when a thought starts and ends, and often when we're driving, it is like a stream of consciousness, just one kind of thought after the other. They're all kind of mixed up. You end up miles away from where you began. And there's so many triggers and associations in urban environments that people are reminded of a whole lot of different stuff. It really was just made me think, gosh, humans are remarkable, the way that we can get from A to B, manage our lives. You know, a lot of people will talk about their driving time as being where they relax and they process things, and they still get there safely, you know, almost all the time. There's another French plait that day, Prue. I was onto it. This is this tour of Bridget's hairstyles. Yeah, so I like that last one because it was an example of, like I said to you, that often people will just literally say they've got nothing on their mind. If you want to comment in the chat about what thought sample you related to the most, we've already kind of done that, but earlier we talked about what you're thinking about when you're driving. But yeah, it's again something to think about when you're out in the car. Maybe if you're driving with someone else and you're a passenger, ask the driver what they're thinking about. It kind of freaks them out. It's quite fun. But just remind them that they're normal. They don't have to. I've never had any of my drivers tell me that they were thinking about the headway between them and the car in front, for example, even though some of them were traffic engineers. Humans are humans, and they're not thinking about the road code all the time when they're driving, or anticipating, you know, hazards when they're not in a driving test. So to summarize kind of what I think we should, how we should conceptualize all of this, there's 4 different kinds of drivers, and most of us are what I call competent cruisers. They report a lot of daydreaming, but that doesn't really matter because they're really good at regulating their attention. That means that they daydream at the right times and they pay attention at the right times, because they've got good expertise, they're good drivers. And you'll have a sense of this if you sit in the car with someone you just don't feel quite comfortable. It's because their expertise isn't very good more often than the fact that they're daydreaming.
Bridget, we've just had a question there. Wouldn't it interfere with drivers' normal thoughts if they knew someone was sitting next to them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I did the testing so many times over and over. So when I had my my commuting study where I had 10 drivers go from their home to work and back again, the reason I did that over and over was to test that exact thing, because it is a bit weird. But what I found was that there was no difference in the category of thoughts in terms of whether it was daydreaming or thinking about driving between their very first drive with me and their 10th drive, where some of them said, literally, I forgot you were there. So you would think that it would interfere, and it probably does, but I was checking the difference kind of over time and in different situations, so that my baseline was me there, and then I was checking the variation around that, and honestly I think it didn't actually make that much difference. They were pretty happy to tell me what they're thinking. And also, having a passenger is not unusual. It's just that she was this weird researcher, but apparently I'm quite a nice, easy person to have in the car with. So, you know, it would depend. I only, well, I started off in our way only with females because I think it made them more comfortable, but they're very happy to chat and tell me about what was on their mind. So, yeah, my reviewers from the journal articles that I wrote didn't have a problem with that protocol because I tested it over so many drives and, you know, bore that in mind when I was discussing the results. So I think, given that we're all competent cruisers mostly, the thing to remember is that we we can't change people's habits of daydreaming just by sticking up a sign telling them to concentrate. What we can do is engineer and plan environments where it doesn't matter that people are daydreaming. It doesn't matter that humans are humans and that their capabilities and states, you know, vary and they're on a spectrum and they're not feeling well and they're tired. If we design nice self-explaining road environments that are forgiving, then they can think about whatever they like and their brain will bring them back to conscious focus when it needs to. If you think you're not a competent cruiser like me, a competent daydreamer, or some other combination, feel free to put it in the chat, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, we're going to have a break now. And this is my picture of pastries and coffees in Paris. And some of those are in London, I think, from my recent travels to Europe. So feel free to comment in the chat, but we're going to have a little break and we'll come back in literally 3 minutes at 3:06. Yes. And I'll see you all again soon. Hi everyone and welcome back. So a friend of mine did her research on daydreaming during walking. Well, she did a lot of things actually, but one of her studies was looking at how people pick up information when they're not paying attention to whatever transport task they're doing. And she did her PhD in the Netherlands. And this is interesting for us because pedestrians daydream too, surprising no one. So her study was on people in the Netherlands walking down the street, and she placed this sandwich board in their path and they had to walk around it. And then she asked them a few meters further down the street whether they realized that they'd done that, and most of them didn't. And even though they had diverted around it, some of them couldn't tell her that there was anything that they had diverted around. So it just goes to show that people can adapt to their environment and make actions and behaviors without consciously thinking about it, especially for really well practiced tasks like driving and walking. What about cycling? So I haven't seen any research on daydreaming or mind wandering during cycling, but I suspect, well, I know that I daydream when I ride my bike, but it's different. It's a different kind of state of awareness from driving or walking. Especially because most of my cycling is on busy urban streets that don't have great separated cycling infrastructure. So you tend to be very aware a lot of the time and can only really relax in certain situations where there's not much traffic or much else kind of going on. So my guess is that somebody who is walking for recreation, like if you're literally walking in the park or across a paddock or something and there's nothing to disturb you, no reason to be paying attention, then you're quite often doing that to daydream, to relax, to switch off. And so that situation, I think, is when someone's most likely to report a lot of mind wandering. Cycling on quiet streets is the same thing. It's a similar kind of vibe. Oh, you have snakes in paddocks. Well, non-disabled person walking for recreation in New Zealand where there are no snakes or nefarious creepy crawlies. It's another word for you in my bio. Peru, nefarious. Most everyday driving, I think, is in the middle where we switch between driving task focus and daydreaming depending on the momentary demands of the situation. Cycling in busy traffic is less mind wandering. And I think because I've got a friend who is blind who I talk to about transport a lot, he says, in fact, he's listened to a talk about my PhD and he said he found it very scary because as a blind person walking around, he has to concentrate all the time or else he will walk off the road or into another person or into traffic. So I think a blind person walking is least mind wandering. And with that in mind, we're going to go back to Miro and I will share my Miro and show you what we're going to do, which is here. So we scroll down to exercise 3, your wandering mind, and I want you to be very specific. So listen to these instructions carefully. You're going to get a sticky note, which is just under the arrow, and you're going to write a comment in this format: a something person, walking, cycling, or driving in this situation. So my one is going to be a sleepy person driving in busy motorway traffic. So this is a bit complicated, my one that I've chosen. I'm going to put it in the middle because on the one hand, a sleepy person is distractible and they don't have much energy, so they're thinking about other things. But driving in busy motorway traffic commands your attention. So this is not a good situation for that driver because they're kind of making themselves pay attention. In some of my driving studies, so you can go ahead and write your examples while I'm chatting. Some of my drivers, I asked them at the end of each drive a series of questions about how they were feeling, and one of them was, how sleepy are you, or how tired are you? And some of them would say, oh, I've been paying a lot of attention because I know that I'm tired. So some people have a kind of overt compensation where they will get into the car and be like, right, some people will tell themselves, I'm going to pay attention, I know I need to put the effort in because I'm tired and I don't want to do something I regret. So some people have a little chat to themselves about that, whether it works or not. You know, I don't know. Gosh, my one's quite big. Maybe I'll make that a bit smaller. So let's see some examples that we've got. Lots of mind wandering. An angry person driving on the motorway. A happy person walking in the park. An angry person, yeah, usually if you're angry, unless you're angry about traffic. So I don't know if we had yet discussion about my theory of not much. Oh yeah, it was in that quadrant where I talked about competent cruisers. There was one that was like boy races. There are some people who think about driving a lot and intently, but they're not good drivers, and they're intentionally speeding and intentionally weaving in traffic, and they're focused on driving, they're just breaking the rules at the same time. So road safety is, you know, not directly correlated with daydreaming. You can be very much focused on the driving task, but doing it badly at the same time. Beginners driving for the first time, yeah, not much mind wandering happens then. It's like learning any task, and I think about it similar way to learning a new musical instrument. If you start learning the cello, as I've done this year, there's a whole lot of different stuff to think about. You've got to hold the bow in one hand and the cello in the other hand, and you've got fingering and where you position your wrist and your head and your shoulders and everything else. The more you do those individual things, the more well practiced they become, and the more your autopilot can take over. And it's the same with driving, especially if you're learning to drive a manual car. There's lots to do. You've got feet, pedals, steering wheel, indicators, looking around you for hazards. You've got some driving instructor yelling at you as well. So there's a lot going on, and it takes a lot of attention. We've got an energetic person cycling in morning rush hour traffic, not much mind wandering. Yeah, there's a similar kind of vibe sometimes with energetic cyclists and energetic drivers. They're really into it. If someone really enjoys the task that they're doing, they quite often enjoy that because they're really engaged. What else have we got? A depressed person walking across an unsignalized intersection. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of people whose minds are elsewhere for a lot of reasons. Let's say an allergic person, an allergic person cycling the park, allergic to parks. A runner trying to break her Strava PB. Yeah. So they're thinking about running. They're also thinking about Strava, and they're thinking about the competition of trying to break their PB. So a lot of these things are kind of complex, right? Which is why I think it's so interesting. You can be thinking about driving. Like, what about the example of if you're thinking about where to find a parking space? That's driving related, but it's not related to the road right in front of you, because you're thinking about where you're going to be going. And sometimes you think, oh, if I go to that parking building, I'll have to take that route. I have to position myself in a different lane. Driving's really complex, especially if you want to get somewhere and not just kind of drive around in circles. So I'd like to commend you all on following my instructions. Riding a bike with a cello on your back, well, usually my cello's in the trailer, which leads to not much mind wandering because I don't want to break it. So go gently. It's a very similar kind of mode of operation as driving a car with a trailer, a bike with a trailer. You kind of slow, give yourself lots of space around bollards and corners and things, quite aware of traffic. You don't want to have anyone come up too close behind you, that kind of thing. I love this. I love this is probably my favorite of the Miros. I think we're going to keep all of these and I'll put them up in my office.
Bridget, I think back to when my children were really young, and that time when you have a screaming, hungry baby in the back, and it's just every sense is, it just scatters your brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
I try to think about that with other drivers sometimes,
That's really compassionate way of thinking. Yeah, what stresses that person under? And it may be that they are waiting for the baby to go to sleep. They might be hoping they get somewhere fast so they can offload the baby to someone else. Yep. They may be feeling guilty. They may be, worried, or they, there's all sorts, like you say, going on, and not much of it is driving related, or at least not so much awareness of the road around them. They might be thinking about where they're going and how quickly they're getting there, but that's just a completely natural and unavoidable human life situation that a lot of us have encountered or will encounter. So yeah, definitely. Okay, great. I'm going to stop sharing that one. And we'll go back to, So bringing human factors, inclusive access and raised crossings together, we have got the who of raised crossings involved in all the other aspects of it. So in terms of the why, we want to design crossings that are safe for all people. That's written into our policies, into legislation. That includes drivers, cyclists and pedestrians. And all of them are likely to be operating at less than perfect human capacity when they come across that crossing. So bear this in mind when you're working with Ken on Wednesday, and we're talking about visibility and standards and where you might put signage and what kinds of gradients and limit lines and where to have priority and not. All of these things relate to how much forgivingness and how much allowance we want to have for the driver, the cyclist and the pedestrian who may not necessarily be thinking about the rules of the road and what's in front of them at that moment in time. When we think about Prue's topic, the where of raised crossings, and we combine that with who, obviously where we put a crossing depends on people. We're not going to put them in Mars just yet. There's no one there. Why would we do that? So thinking about who is there now, and also who's not there now. You've probably heard already about the danger of using warrants to justify a raised crossing. So counting people across the street now and using that to say, well, therefore we need a raised crossing. It's not always the best way to approach the decision, because a lot of people are put off crossing the street because it's not safe enough, it's not comfortable enough, it's not accessible enough. So that's super important. And the standards that we have, like I've said earlier, have been built from this understanding of humans and their variability, sometimes by accident. Like we just end up with engineering that we know works. Why does it work? Because humans are that way. We haven't gone from first principles and tested people's vision and reaction times necessarily. We just know from experience that this kind of metric works in this kind of speed environment or traffic volume. So that's what we'll hear more about on Wednesday. So why raised crossings? This is probably the kind of crux slide that brings my PhD research together with raised crossings. And I even said so in a road policy paper that came out of my PhD, where people are like, well, okay, drivers' minds wander. What do we do about that? Well, we design environments where either it doesn't matter if a driver's mind is wandering. So whether a driver's thinking about it or not, they're going to slow down for a raised crossing, and a pedestrian is the same. They're going to know that there's a crossing there because it's so conspicuous. Because they're conspicuous, they are likely to interrupt a driver's daydream. They're not just cruising straight along, and it's not something they're likely to miss. But even if they do, it doesn't matter so much. And they're also really obvious, even for people who don't speak the language of transport. So, when I talked with disabled people about walking around, they'll often say, oh, there wasn't a crossing there, where there was, in fact, a refuge island, for example. But most people don't think about refuge islands as crossings. They think of zebras as crossings, and that's what they'll call a crossing. So it makes it a really obvious and attractive place where people know that that's where you cross the street, and you can teach that to children from a young age. They all know what a zebra crossing is. So these all of these ideas kind of come together in the Principles of Inclusive Access, which have been published with Waka Kotahi, that's New Zealand Transport Agency's online pedestrian design guidance, to help inform transport designers of how you know whether you've got an inclusive bit of infrastructure or not. How do you know? Well, if it's safe, obvious, and has smooth, step-free choices, which I'm going to say many times in the next few minutes, then it's an SOS bit of infrastructure, and that means that it's going to be inclusive of as many people as possible. And the principles were developed through a number of interviews with disabled people, with groups of disabled people, and they've been tested time and again in forums and infrastructure projects. And they're just a really good rule of thumb when you're out and about looking at a site. If it's a safety audit, if it's a corridor improvement project, an intersection project, you can think to yourself, is this safe, obvious, and have smooth, step-free choices? And if it does, then it's going to be good. If there's something that you think's not quite right about it, in terms of pedestrian safety particularly, then it will often be one of these 3 factors. So I'll go through all of them now. So the first one is safe, and safe means survivable speeds. It means speeds where if someone makes a mistake, they're not going to be killed or seriously injured. And I'm sure you all know a lot about that from Hafez's talk, but also generally from your work in road safety and understanding Vision Zero, safe system assessment, safe system principles, that we want speeds to be managed. That means separating out faster and slower moving traffic and people. But safe also includes feeling safe and comfortable. So that means we have crime prevention through environmental design, we have good lighting, we have good open spaces where people don't feel at risk of harassment or attack. You might look at this picture and say, well, that's not a priority crossing, it's not a raised zebra crossing. Does that affect how safe it is? And for me, a little bit, but not very much, because safety in this context is primarily affected by the speed environment. And if you have a raised crossing, then speeds are going to be pretty low. However, that example on the previous page was not very obvious to all people that it is a crossing. Remember I said earlier that a lot of people don't think it's a crossing unless it's got zebras on it or a traffic light. Obvious is my favorite of SOS principles because it's the most left out or ignored or poorly understood by transport people, because we don't learn about it. Obvious means that people who don't speak the language of transport will know where they're supposed to be in the road, and will know where to cross or will know where to stop to give way. So that means that everybody, whatever mode they're on, has their place, and they know that, or they're obviously excluded, and they know that as well, which is fine. Sometimes we put up fences and barriers and we don't let people use a bit of infrastructure because it's not safe. That's fine as long as we make it obvious. Obvious also means that people can get around using wayfinding that's on the street and online. And in the example I gave really early on in the talk about Martha waiting for her train, it means information's available to people in a variety of ways, not just audible, not just written down. So this example is just in a car park. It's not even an official zebra because it's not on public land, but zebras are obvious wherever they are. I love seeing zebras in car parks because car parks can be a nightmare to navigate otherwise. And it's not a raised crossing, but to me, that doesn't affect, for the pedestrian's perspective, how obvious it is, because it's a zebra. It's obvious that that's where people are going to cross, and they're attracted to these things. So, as Prue said the other day, we can have a raised path that has no priority. It's not self-explaining. That's not what we would call a raised crossing. And we could have a raised crossing that doesn't have zebras on it. That doesn't give priority to path users. So that's not self-explaining either. And these things all fail because they're not obvious and not obvious enough. And we might argue about the letter of the law, and there's laws are different and road rules are different in different countries. But from a road user's perspective, if we have to argue about it, then it's not obvious enough. And that's why SOS is really good. It's also useful to bear in mind because one of the worst things we can do is to make an obvious crossing that's not safe. Because if it looks obvious to the road using public, then they are going to use it. And the more that they use it, the more likely that there will be a death in that road crossing, as there was in this one. So if we put traffic signals with a flush crossing in a 50 or 60k road environment, pedestrians will die, which is exactly what happened at this mid-block signalised pedestrian crossing, which is near where I used to live. It's near a primary school, and within a few months of it being installed, there was a 67-year-old crossing the street with the green signal. She had priority crossing as a pedestrian, and a driver drove straight through, didn't even notice that the lights were there, and she was killed. So that is a very obvious pedestrian crossing, but it wasn't safe. So these principles have to work together if we're going to get good outcomes. Now, the second S in SOS is smooth step-free choices. And this is my favourite one to think about when you are a pedestrian going through a temporary work site or a road work site, because there are often not smooth step-free choices around those work sites. Sometimes they are marked diversions, but often they're just gravel or unsealed. So a smooth step-free route has to be safe and obvious for it to be to tick these boxes, and it can't be too far out of the way because that's not fair or useful or helpful. And it should be a route that people can use independently, so they shouldn't need help to find it or to navigate it. So in raised crossings, zebra crossings, we often have a challenge of providing for good drainage in the road environment, and also providing that smooth step-free surface. And Ken's going to talk about that on Wednesday, how we make those trade-offs and why we might choose sometimes to keep the drainage channel or not, and what the implications might be. Just because we have safe, obvious, smooth step-free crossings as the gold standard doesn't mean we have to put them everywhere. It would be my goal or my vision for the transport sector that we actually just map these things, and if we talk with the community about where they walk and where they choose to walk, where they find comfortable, then those are the safe, obvious step-free routes if you're including all people in those conversations. And that's okay. We don't need to have every single bit of road covered in wombats. They have too many wombats. And also not enough money to spend on like hip replacements and stuff, right? So we've got to be a bit picky about where we put these things. So we just want to make sure that people can participate and get to where they need to go to live a good life. And if we collect more data about who's doing that, then we'll know that we're spending our money well and not, going too far. Yeah, so as long as there are options between where people want to go, then we can fill up the other routes or crossings with extra crossing opportunities for people who have more capability in a better state. To give them more options. Doesn't mean we can't do that. So our last mirror exercise today is going to be talking about this principle of obvious. So we'll all jump over there. I will share my screen. Share. Where'd it go? There. Awesome. So we just pick a sticky note again. What makes these crossings obvious or not? So I'm going to do an example in the top. We've got just curb cuts. These are the same examples as we had earlier in the day. I'm going to say that this is not obvious. No zebra markings or traffic signals, because most people rely on those to let them know that it's an obvious crossing. Yeah, see how creative you can get with thinking about how obvious or not these things are. So in the bottom one, for example, the eagle-eyed amongst you will know that there are no tactiles on the right-hand side, not obvious to a blind person. On the right, no tactiles. Because obviously, obvious varies, is subjective. And if I went to Paris, which I did in August, and it was awesome, except I thought it was going to be 30 degrees, and then I realized I was looking at the date and not the temperature. That was funny. It was actually like 24, perfect. In Paris, they have really obvious markings on the road for where bikes should be. They have bike symbols all over the place, and it's good because the bike paths are quite inconsistent. Sometimes they're in the middle of a boulevard, sometimes they're on the edge of the road like a cycle lane in Australia and New Zealand, sometimes they are down the middle of a one-way street like a sharrow. So those markings just make it really obvious where bikes should be, which is great for cyclists but also for pedestrians and car drivers to know. So let's see what we've got here. Not obvious, no zebra, no marking, no tactile, no colour. How do we even know it's a crossing exactly? So the one on the bottom, the raised zebra, is obvious. It's got zebra crossing with colour. It's visible from the zebra markings, raised platform, bump in the road, cars must slow down. And yeah, someone else has pointed out there's no tactile on the right hand side. But the colour and contrast is really good. Yeah, super obvious. Okay, we're going to come back now because we've got a bit more to get through.
Bridget, we've had one question here. Can you discuss the difference between walking with mind wandering and walking while texting?
There's a difference between using a mobile phone and daydreaming. And the difference is your eyesight, basically. So daydreaming doesn't involve your eyes. When you're mind wandering and when you're daydreaming and walking or daydreaming and driving a car, your eyes are still looking at the road and you're creating this feedback loop to your brain about what it's seeing and what it's doing. When you're texting, whether you're a pedestrian or a car driver, you're not getting that information because you're looking at your screen. So you could walk anywhere and drive anywhere and your brain's got no chance of correcting you because it's not getting that information. So that's why the two types of distraction are fundamentally different. And it does irk me. There's a one syllable but good word for you, Prue, irk. It irks me when they're lumped together as being distractions that are bad, because daydreaming is not a distraction that's bad. It's a human characteristic that is evolutionarily adaptable and a good thing. But texting, anything that takes your eyes off the road or the path is a visual distraction, which means your brain can't do its autopilot thing because it's not getting the info. Okay. So there are examples around the place. Let's see if you can find somewhere near out and about yourself of safe, obvious, smooth, step-free crossings. This one is in my hometown of Hamilton. There's it's a nice, smooth, slow, low-speed environment, but it also has traffic signal mid-block crossing for people who want that obvious choice, and I think it works really well. Yeah, raised crossings, of which this is one.
Bridget, I love this one because in a lot of shared zones and very low speed environments, we have the same pavement markings, but I've noticed with children that they really recognise that the black asphalt is the road and they will keep away from it. Whereas I had a friend who told me that she asked her kids to get off the road and they all ran onto the road because it was all the same pavement markings. So I'm like, we can put TGSIs for people with vision impairments and they can hang out, but children you know, are highly reliant on this.
Oh, children, absolutely. And, you know, this weekend, I've still got my keyring. I was volunteering at the Special Olympics New Zealand, which is for people with learning disabilities. And they're a group that I've talked with in transport stuff. And they absolutely rely on obvious crossings as well. And I know that people with learning disabilities and the advocates that work with them, they are strong advocates against putting art on a roadway surface, for example. So, yep, we want public art in public places, on buildings, on walls, off the street. But you put art on a street and there is a lot of people in society, like children and like adults with learning disabilities, like people with dementia, for example, who suddenly have no idea that that's a traffic lane. So yeah, contrast is good and art is awesome, but keep it off the road surface. So now we're going to go through some disability sector engagement content, and this is why. Because in New Zealand and in every country, actually, we have this complex kind of hierarchy of who's the boss and where our policies come from and how that gets enacted. So we have ministry, national level. We have in New Zealand our transport agency, converting that policy into investment. We have regional and local authorities turning that into infrastructure on the ground. And then along the side of all of that, we have all these different groups of people having their say about what might go where and why. But community is a bit ad hoc in that process. process, and it can mean that if we don't have a policy system where we're measuring an outcome, like I said earlier, diversity of participation or inclusiveness of participation, if we're not measuring that, then how do we know whether we're delivering stuff that's good for people, good for all people? Well, one good way to find out is to talk with them. Like I said, in road safety, we have all of that stuff really comprehensively covered, and we know whether or not we're reducing crashes. We talk about inclusive and accessible transport. It's like we're doing it for charity and we throw some accessible bus stops in there and pat ourselves on the back. We don't actually know whether we've made anyone's life better because we don't measure that outcome specifically. It's like if we did road safety without any crash data. And I have tried to do this thought experiment and imagine if we did road safety without crash data, and I can't do it. we rely on it so much. We just can visualize crash maps in our heads. We know what fatal, serious and minor injury crashes are, and it's such an important part of our investment as well. So why do we do inclusive access, or try to do it without any outcome variable that we're measuring? We want to improve participation. So in the absence of that data, then we need to talk to people. And we need to talk to disabled people because there are a lot of them. And in New Zealand, I said earlier, we have 24% of our whole population identifies as disabled. And 17% of New Zealand's population is Māori. However, transport professionals aren't diverse like that. And we were talking about that earlier with the bias perhaps towards commutes to work. 2/3 of our profession is male, and less than 2% identify as Māori, less than 2% identify as disabled. That's according to our professional body. Did a survey a few years ago, and this pictogram in the middle just shows the age structure of those people. So there are more disabled people the older you get. But even in younger age groups, there are a lot of disabled people who are children, and there are a lot who are working aged. In fact, 40% of working age Māori in New Zealand are disabled people. That's huge. That's a huge number. And so we should be designing for them. So because of all of these things, if we don't talk to people whose lives are affected by decisions, then we're kind of designing and planning without knowing whether what we're going to do is the best thing for those people. So before we have really good data, it's like advocating for talking to victims of road crashes, or there are advocates for students against driving distracted and that kind of thing who do a really good job. We don't have any crash data for inclusive access, so we need to talk to the people whose lives that affects. And there's a guide that I wrote for that a while ago, which I think is in your learning management system. You can access that, or just contact me and ask me, and I'll send it to you. And this is kind of the summary of it, of why it's important. At the moment, we're at the top of this hierarchy where we have reactive advocacy, and there are really good advocates for disability who demand accessible transport, both in a kind of reactive way to infrastructure that doesn't work, and also proactively in planning. But we want to get to proactive inclusion where we know where we're including people, and so we know that if we invest in a race crossing that we're going to get some good outcome. So in the guide that I wrote, there's a flowchart to help you know who to engage with and for different kinds of projects. So if we understand the impacts of this activity and that it affects disabled people, so we're going to upgrade an intersection, for example. If it affects specific local communities, then we don't need to talk to local people, but we can talk to disability groups. So an example might be road user rule changes. If it is going to affect local people because you're digging up the street directly, then talk to the local disability community. And there's methods and lists of groups and websites in the guide to help you actually find those people. But now for something completely different. Here is just 1 minute of my friend Paul Brown talking about why disability sector engagement is important. Hopefully you can read that because you can't hear it. So I'm going to put that video on LinkedIn later today because Paul is Scottish and he's got the most beautiful accent, and I should have been more prepared so that I knew how to share that sound with you. But what he's saying is that it takes a lot of effort for disabled people to infiltrate and to bang on the doors of transport sector organisations, and that can be effective, but what's more useful is if we start a conversation and talk to each other. And the best way to do that is to just find out who your local advocates are. There's probably accessibility advisory groups associated with your councils. Get to know the people there, take them out for a coffee, talk about what you're interested in, and you'll find mutual interests really quickly. And then when it comes to a specific project or plan, then you'll have contacts there and it won't be too tricky to get going. And a reason that we can do this is that it makes us more likely to get the projects across the line that we want to have invested in. And so we can use that engagement to get local stories like this one. For example, my mother-in-law couldn't walk to her local dairy, that's the same as a milk bar, Australians, because there were too many roads to cross. Now that the crossings have been improved, she can make the trip on her own. She likes it. She doesn't have to rely on other people to do her shopping. So having these kinds of stories, you know, however much data you've got about speed reductions and traffic volume changes, local tangible stories like that can be really useful for politicians because they love knowing that they've helped people to live their lives. And then it can kind of encourage, you know, best practice changes going into the future. So let's just have a little reflection on what we've learned today. Or if you've got any questions, comments, feel free to put them in as well. But what have you learned about why raised crossings are a good design solution for all people? You can tell me what SOS stands for if you want to make me feel happy about myself. Like I've achieved something in my day. Yes. The reason I put smooth, it used to just be safe, obvious, and step-free, but there's a lot of step-free paths that are gravel or rubbish, or especially at like work sites. And, you know, even if you're pushing a child in a buggy, it's a real mission to try and get them through. So you imagine trying to negotiate that with a wheelchair. Or a good way to think about it is with a road bike. If you can't get through with a road bike, then it's not smooth enough. Yeah. That one about people not speaking the language of transport. I remember when I was a civil engineering student and I was driving around with pavement crews doing tests on asphalt. It was pretty exciting. And we were counting edge marker posts and route position kind of signs on the side of the highway. And I was like, I've never even noticed that these things are there. We spend all our lives driving up and down the countryside and all around the place. I couldn't have told you what an edge marker post was if you'd hit me over the head with one. Whereas after a couple of weeks in a road marking truck or in a roadworks crew, you notice edge marker posts, especially when they're dirty or marginal or whatever. So it's just good to be aware of our own biases and habits, and the way that what our brain sees isn't the way that what other people's brains see. And even knowing that can help you to make good decisions, like engaging with disabled people. It's really interesting talking to people who are blind about how they get around. Like my friend Paul will say that he can tell how big a room is that he is standing in just because of the way the air is moving around in it. So he has grown up to just have that kind of spatial awareness because he's blind, to know from his voice, from how sound reverberates, and from the air how big a room is. Whereas you get all of us and we close our eyes would be rubbish probably at that kind of thing if you were just placed in a room and asked to say how big it is.
We've got some awesome ones here, Bridget.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, this is really good. Some great knowledge.
Charlotte saying all humans will experience some form of impairment at some stage in their life, so we need to design the network with all people and situations in mind.
Exactly.
We're like thinking about people who don't speak the language of transport. Nice.
Yeah.
Safe, obvious.
Excellent. And capturing drivers' attention when we can. Feel free to keep typing them in and I'll go through this summary. So why is inclusion important? Well, it's important because of legislation, policy and ethics. You know, I think those of you who are chartered engineers or belong to a professional body, planning institute or whatever your professional body is, I think ethics is going to become more prominent in coming years, especially with climate change and our commitments to be ethical in terms of the environment. I think the public expectation of what professionals do is going to be in the spotlight a bit more. We make decisions that affect, emissions in land transport and affect people's safety. We're going to have to stand up and defend those decisions. So ethics is really important. And if we don't focus on inclusion, then we will exclude people. And that's what's happened over several centuries, really, of infrastructure planning. What have raised crossings got to do with driver behaviour? Well, they're conspicuous, they're likely to capture a driver's attention, and even if they don't, as Kathy said, then it doesn't matter. They're slowing down, so it matters less if the pedestrians or the drivers are daydreaming. Human states and traits are continuous, are not distinct categories. So we think about all of us as, varying individuals. I was watching this athletics thing on the weekend, and some of these people can sprint so fast and throw a shot put way further than I can. We're not all as athletically gifted as others, and the same thing is relevant when we're walking around the streets and trying to cross them. Some people have a permanent impairment, but actually we should be designing for everyone, even if they're tired or feeling a bit sick, or if they're in pain and they just want to get somewhere as quickly as possible and don't really want to have to look up and around them. Permanent, temporary and situational impairments, they're a really good, situational, that's a typo I haven't seen before today. They're a really good thing to take back for your teams to do as a morning tea exercise or something, just to talk about temporary, situational, permanent impairments. Microsoft give that away, so you can download those pictures and have a chat in your workplace about what examples people might be able to come up with, and use the example of, just walking for a coffee, because everybody does that, don't they, in workplaces? You're walking for a coffee, what kinds of situational temporary impairments might affect you when you're crossing the street? How many biscuits you bought, or whether you're eating your cream bun or not at the time. We haven't talked in depth about finding age distribution or income by area, but we've talked about why those things are important and could be useful when you're planning and designing raised crossings, especially where to put them. So finding out about the community that you're working for, their characteristics, the household levels of car ownership and income, and what kind of places in that community people might want to walk to. You can ask them, that's the best way to find out, but to start with mapping and finding the local destinations. Locally relevant statistics about disability can be really important, because there are so many disabled people out there that we can use those numbers to justify really good and inclusive design, because I think a lot of people in the general public have no clue just how many disabled people there are who would benefit from some of this stuff. What are the SOS principles of inclusive street design? Well, you all pretty much nailed that. Safe. And remember that safe includes feeling safe. I've got a friend who's doing a master's thesis at the moment on queer people's experiences on public transport, and queer people are far more likely to experience harassment and abuse, and therefore be scared of using public transport. And there's stuff we can do as transport professionals to make people feel more safe when it comes to public transport. The main one is to have nice frequent services, so you're not waiting around at bus stations for ages, worrying about what might happen to you there. So, road crossings, raised crossings are good for everybody. Get people places as fast as possible. Obvious is for people who don't speak the language of transport, and smooth step-free choices. Honestly, if you start taking photos of roadwork sites that have good smooth step-free options for pedestrians, you send them to me and I'll send you a chocolate fish, which is like Kiwi version of a golden wombat. A lot of work sites do not have smooth, obvious step-free choices for pedestrians. So that's it. We've ripped through that today. So yeah, any other questions or feedback, feel free to contact me. I'm going to be here on Wednesday to facilitate Ken's session. So anything else from you, Prue?
What keeps going through my head when we talk about some of these issues and talking to disabled people is a sense of how Well, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about giving people agency. And my own experience is that when I go out onto the network, I want to have agency over being able to stay alive as I'm going to wherever I want to go. And if there's a raised crossing there, if there's any kind of crossing there, I can wait until the environment's safe and it will become safe and I have a sense of agency. But without that, it's 100% reliant on my decision making and my ability to judge the environment. And I'm just wondering, is there anything about giving agency to people in this discussion? Or
there's certainly a lot of literature in kind of anthropology and political science and sociology about who has power and who doesn't in a community. I haven't seen it framed that way in terms of, or certainly in terms of giving people autonomy, freedom, so and it kind of depends, what political context you're in and what kind of words you might want to use, because you could come at it from any angle. Raised crossings are often the answer, right? Like it's a bit like separated bike lanes. It's the answer to a lot of questions, and it doesn't really matter what angle you come from. But giving people agency. Certainly, when you talk to disabled people, when there's been infrastructure gone in that has helped them cross the street, they use words like liberated and relieved, and especially if they're talking about sending their children, and that's what a lot of people can relate to, sending your children to do something independently. It's game changing, for those reasons.
I also had with the with the safe, obvious and step free, to me it seems like the raised crossings, one of their real strengths is, even if I'm daydreaming and I've got no brain power, reading all the signs and there's a lot going on, if I see a bump in the road as a driver, I'm intuitively going to know I need to slow down. Like it's got an instruction manual of this is what you do now. And so my foot is on the brake or off the accelerator. Like that's got to be a good thing. And I don't think it would take any brain power for me to do that.
That's right. And it doesn't even rely on the markings being there, because sometimes a flush zebra crossing looks great when it's first put in, but they fade over time, or sometimes in the rain it's not so clear. Whereas a raised lump of asphalt, if it's a different level from the road surface around it, it's going to be there, and drivers will notice it. Also, you can see in our own backgrounds, there's more markings as well. So there's more kind of redundancy in that visual kind of cue to drivers. They tend to be built out a little bit or have tactiles on them. So the whole package is got lots of different cues that would really readily line up with the driver's unconscious expectation of what they're going to do. And it's like when you're playing the cello and after a while it's all automatic. So they tell me. And then you just read the music and you can see a couple of bars coming up of what you're going to do next, and your body just does it. And it's the same with driving. You can just keep thinking about fish and chips. Everybody stays alive. Yeah.
I also want to say I really like the idea you mentioned about, in terms of having quick and easy ways to come and look at this project, like the crossing you talked about where you measured before and after, and there was a small increase in the number of users but a huge increase in the diversity. It seems like something really not difficult to do on any project, really.
Yeah, that's not difficult to do, but it's quite difficult to get permission to do, as it turns out. Like, I haven't seen many places around the world at all to do that. It seems like such a simple thing to me to count wheelchairs and walking sticks and crutches and other mobility aids, because in New Zealand, for example, we estimate, data's not great, but we estimate about 3% of the population uses a mobility aid. So it's the perfect visual indicator of people who have more difficulty walking, because it's literally a mobility aid. And yet we don't collect any data about it. So again, that's one of my kind of career goals, is if we have a city mapped for diversity of pedestrians, like we have crash maps, then how interesting would that be to highlight the places that are not as inclusive as others? Yeah.
Hey, any other questions here? If anyone's got any questions, you can put them in the chat now. I think we're good.
That'd be good.
Okay, well, thank you, Bridget. So next time, in the next session, Bridget will be back to chair the session. The next session will be getting into the nitty-gritty of how and putting everything we've been learning so far into into road design guidance, really. We'll be looking at how we address all those issues on the ground, thinking about things like sight lines, about speed control, ramp gradients, drainage, lighting, all of those kind of things, and different situations where you'll be putting them in. So look forward to that. And thank you very much, Bridget. It was entertaining and informing and knowledgeable and unpredictable once again.
Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to Ken's session. I have facilitated that session a few times now, and everybody, it's honestly literally the highest rated one of the whole module. Like, you thought these ones were good, just you wait. People love details and designs, and it's always a really action-packed and fun session. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.